Play for your next falafel?
Ran Shapira's sneer could have frozen the Dead Sea. Ilana Cohen didn't flinch right away. She finished the measure, let the chord decay inside the battered upright's loose soundboard, and only then lifted her hands. Fingerless gloves, nail beds rimmed in gray. The piano sat where it always sat, under the ironwork canopy of Jerusalem's first station. A restored Ottoman-era rail terminal turned public square with food stalls, family crowds, and the kind of constant, wandering music you can't quite tell if you're hearing or remembering. Someone had donated the instrument a year ago, or 5, depending on whose story you trusted. It lived its days a half-step flat under the wind, its keys shined down by thousands of tourists who knew 2 bars of Fur-Elise and exactly 1 octave's worth of Let It Be. At Ilana's feet, a bent cardboard sign in block letters, "Music student, seeking assistance." The edges had softened from too much handling. Beside the sign, a plastic cup with a few agaro and a couple of wrinkled banknotes, their corners feathered like used tickets. Ran nudged his wife, who was taller than the phone she held and thinner than the expression on her face. "Look at this one, Habibi. She thinks she's a musician." The word Habibi wasn't meant for Ilana, wasn't even a tenderness so much as a performance of intimacy. But she registered it the way a violinist registers humidity, a fact that changes sound. Around them, phones tilted. People who had planned to buy ice cream now paused. A ring formed with the casual speed of curiosity. Ran's clothes fit like money in a world where taste is a resource. Hair silvered deliberately. Watch face big enough to double as a mirror. He let a 50-shekel note drift down in front of Ilana like he was feeding a koi. The bill skated across the stone and came to rest against the piano leg. "There's a real piano across the street," he said. "A Steinway Grand, worth more than a high-end condo." He spoke to Ilana the way a hotelier speaks to a complaint. Calmly, with the easy superiority of someone whose problems have solutions with price tags. "Hotel ballroom," he added, chin lifting toward the glow beyond the arches. "Tonight." His thumb hovered over his camera app. The lens looked like a shiny black eye.
"You are a music student.
"If you can actually play something worth hearing, I'll make it worth your while. When you can't, don't say I didn't warn you." Ilana set her palms on her knees. Her gloves left threads on the denim. She'd learned to portion her movements the way she portioned meals, small, deliberate, in ways that kept her from slipping on the inside. She let the mocking tone fall past her and land wherever that kind of thing lands when you can't afford to carry it. The night wind swept the platform in slow breaths that smelled like sugar, oil, and late trains that would never come. 2 years earlier, people hadn't looked away from Ilana. They'd leaned forward. She had worn evening fabrics that moved like water and borrowed heels that bit. She had played student showcases at the big hall in Tel Aviv and scored pairs of approving nods from teachers who were stingy with their praise. At the Jerusalem Academy of Music and Dance, the Academy, capital A, she'd been the full-ride kid from a working-class neighborhood whose piano technique fit the word lineage. Her professors said touch and time in the tones of liturgy. Her parents, who didn't use words like that, still understood them. The things she did with 10 fingers and soft wrists made the air honest. Then the call at 2 a.m. "Ilana lay," her mother said. A voice shaped around tenderness, even for bad news. "It's Mama. They found it. Stage 4. Pancreas." Israel's public HMO, Kupat Holim, covers basics well enough that people who've never balanced a bill can afford to speak broadly about social contracts. The experimental therapy didn't sit on the basics. The estimate for staying ahead of a disease that does not negotiate ran to something like 700,000 shekels, roughly $180,000. Ilana's father, Moshe, a defense factory man with grease lines that never fully left his nails, started taking extra shifts even before they asked him to. Her mother, Dvorah, a nurse at Hadassah Hospital, Ein Kerem, stayed calm on the phone and then cried in the bathroom at work. Ilana sat up the rest of the night and pressed her hands flat until the shakes stopped, and the idea of tomorrow felt like a place you could step. 3 days later, she withdrew from the academy. She told herself it was a leave. She told her teacher she'd be back after they figured out the treatment. She told her mother nothing at all, just kissed her cheek and brought her tea and laughed at a joke that wasn't funny, and put her shoulder under the family until the weight was in motion. She told her mother nothing at all, just kissed her cheek and brought her tea and laughed at a joke that wasn't funny, and put her shoulder under the family until the weight was in motion. The months that followed arranged themselves into 2 categories: necessary and merely urgent. Ilana worked a daytime cafe shift in Rehavia. 6:15 a.m. arrival, 6:30 doors. Espresso for men who said please when they had slept and now when they hadn't. She took an evening cleaning job in a downtown office building on Jaffa Road, pushing a grey cart whose wheels pulled left, polishing surfaces no one noticed until they were dirty. At night she walked dogs in Sacha Park, big ones that pulled and little ones that shivered, and learned the frequency of the police patrols by the way the blue light bounced off benches. On paper, the money covered a life. In practice, it covered time. The treatment bought weeks that were beautiful in the way dawn is beautiful, because it keeps its promise. And then the numbers in the ledger went red again. They sold the apartment. Moshe cashed his pension early and watched the penalties eat a decade. Ilana sold her grandmother's gold charm bracelet, the one with the tiny pomegranate and the little Hamza that caught and released light. The synagogue put their names on a list only the treasurer saw. A neighbor left envelopes that smelled like hand cream. Enough kept meaning almost. Enough kept meaning almost. Stress is a currency with compound interest. It came due the night Moshe stood to stretch in the hospital waiting room, bill in his hand like a flag, and vanished forward onto the tile. The stroke split language from memory. It emptied rooms. For 18 months, Ilana lived different lives under similar fluorescent lights. Oncology during the day, speech therapy at night, notes tucked into the elastic of her glove. Water. List. Thank Dr. M. Don't forget to eat. Her mother died on a Tuesday that built its weather from grey. She died with her hand in Ilana's and her voice still bent toward a child's nickname. Don't let them make you small, Habibi, she whispered. Habibi here as an endearment. The funeral happened quickly, as it should. Bills came slowly, as they always do, in envelopes that leaned against one another in the mailbox like conspirators. The bank said no in a tone that wasn't personal. The foreclosure notice read like a grammar exercise written by someone who didn't believe in nouns. Social services placed Moshe in long-term care, where he stared out windows, and then at Ilana, and then through her. And she learned the singular ache of being erased inside someone who loved you first. Social services placed Moshe in long-term care, where he stared out windows, and then at Ilana, and then through her. And she learned the singular ache of being erased inside someone who loved you first. A year later, Ilana owned the ring on her finger and the clothes on her back. The ring was her mother's, the band thin enough to sing if you tapped it, a circle without hierarchy. She learned the bus stops that broke the wind, which security guards on Ben Yehuda pretended not to see her. which dumpsters kept the freshest bread. She learned what to keep in her pockets and what to cache in a place the body knows how to find, even if the mind thinks it's forgotten. There is nothing theoretical about shelter when the temperature drops. The first station piano became a lifeline, because music is a thing the world can't confiscate. Someone had put it there for ambience, that polite word people use when they want to borrow a feeling without asking where it came from. And most days the instrument performed its duty with stout, wobbly pride. On good afternoons, Ilana made 40 to 60 shekels, around $10 to $16. Enough for a shower at the community center on Emek Rephaim, a hot meal that wasn't assembled from other people's leftovers, and bus fare to see her father without walking the last kilometer. On bad days, wind bleeding through the canopy, tourists scarce, hands stiff with cold. She played for herself, and left with less than she'd arrived with. Either way, she took the gloves off every morning, the pair her mother had knit for Hanukkah during a year when money had been scarce, but warmth plentiful. And she let her hands remember the work. Either way, she took the gloves off every morning, the pair her mother had knit for Hanukkah during a year when money had been scarce but warmth plentiful. And she let her hands remember the work. A human body can host two clocks, one for grief and one for skill. The first runs on its own schedule, the second on repetition. Bach had carved pathways into her motor memory the way water carves into stone, slow, faithful, defining. Chopin tattooed her forearms from the inside. Mozart opened windows in rooms she didn't know her mind had. Technique is mercy disguised as discipline. Today felt heavier. Some days do. There's an inertia to them you can sense an hour before it announces itself. It was in the way the wind stuttered under the canopy, and how the crowd kept breaking and recombining. She had been playing for an hour when the shoes arrived. Leather that didn't understand rain. Soles that tapped in unison. A perfume cloud priced like contempt. She knew that look, the one the bank officer had used when he learned the numbers. The one the well-meaning caseworker used when she slipped a pamphlet across a desk because she knew that was what the form required. The look said, "You are in your place," without moving any muscles. "Please," Ilana said, "I'm trying to make enough for food." "Food?" The wife laughed into her hand as if the sound might bite. "How quaint!" Ran lifted his phone. "Let's give the city a reality check." He flashed a money clip with bills that were crisp enough to stand at attention. 3,000 shekels, about $800. One piece on that Steinway. Something worthy. The number landed like a physical thing, a room for weeks. Groceries. Time to stop making decisions from the bottom of the staircase. "When you fail," he said, shifting his weight so his chin could angle down while the lens pointed up, "you admit what we both know. You're not a musician. You're a homeless girl with delusions." Ilana looked at her hands. The scars were not metaphors. They were small, mean truths acquired in stupid ways. Tin that bit, stone that slipped, wood that didn't care. Her hands were still her hands. They knew things. "My choice of peace?" she asked. "Your funeral," he said. His smile wanted a mirror. "Bach's Goldberg variations," Ilana said. "The complete cycle." The line of phones shivered. Someone in the back who knew enough to be dangerous whispered, "That's over an hour." A few more heads tipped, searching for a face that matched the voice. Rand's eyes flashed something like doubt before they hardened. "Complete what?" 30 variations on a single theme, Ilana said. The teacher in her stepped forward the way habit steps forward when fear would rather stay seated. Technically brutal, beautiful. She stood, her joints cracked in the quiet, unembarrassed, a different instrument tuning. She gathered her sign and her cup the way a worker gathers tools. Her mother's ring flashed. Lead the way. Reporting over 22. Alana Wards.
They crossed the narrow street into light. The hotel knew how to smell like money and not like people. Flowers that gave off as little scent as possible. The faint chemical whisper of polish and stone. Chandeliers did their frozen fireworks routine. Wall art by Israeli painters guarded its color fields while security guards guarded everything else. The Steinway sat where all serious instruments sit in rooms like these, under a clean wash of illumination, centered but aloof. Ilana could feel its presence before she heard it, the way you feel the weight of a person you love enter a room. A guard stepped forward, his hand enjoying the rhythm of resting on his radio. Ilana had seen that choreography before. Before he could speak, a woman intercepted, compact, silver hair disciplined into obedience, a good jacket, the kind of shoes that say, "I attend receptions, but stand when I need to." "I'm Dr. Hannah Levy," she told the guard, holding up a lanyard. "Guest of honor. 5 minutes for a demonstration between sets. I'll take responsibility." He hesitated. People who know what they're responsible for hesitate before they say yes. A stage manager, headset on, appeared like a footnote to the guard's thought. He looked at Levy, then at Ron, who was already preening, then at the piano, as if the instrument might offer its own judgment. "5, the stage manager said. "No more." "Perfect," Ron said, too quickly, which is nearly always unbecoming. "Perfect," Rand said, too quickly, which is nearly always unbecoming. The ballroom knew how to adjust itself to spectacle. Gowns found their well-practiced rustle. Tuxedoed donors turned their bodies into small, temporary stages for getting a better view. People who had not been interested in student artists yesterday suddenly remembered that their alma maters had conservatories. Phones went up in the slow tilt of a tide. Rand bounded onto the platform with the buoyancy of someone convinced he controlled the narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed. "A special moment. A street performer believes she's a classical pianist." The laughter that came wasn't precise. It contained nerves and a little meanness, and the shared relief of not being the object of the joke. Ilana crossed to the bench. It would always be strange that this object, a padded plank with screws and an attitude, could mean home. She sat. The height was right, as if the instrument had been waiting and was dignified enough not to say so. The pedals found her feet. She placed her hands in the air above keys that had been tuned by a person who had learned to listen through other people's sounds. She shut her eyes and saw her mother in the blue dress they had buried her in, because it had been her favorite when her hair was still black and her steps quick. In the private room behind her eyelids, Dvora smiled, like someone who has decided to teach contentment as a discipline. Your gift isn't yours to hide. Not a command. An axiom. An axiom. Ilana began with the aria, 32 measures that contain grace without pleading for it. The first bars were a little stiff, which made sense. Muscles make and unmake habits. The second phrase opened. By the 16th measure, the sound settled into itself the way a body settles into water of the right temperature. The room quieted the way rooms do when they remember they have ears. She took her beat. The breath Bach wrote into the space between reverence and work, and began variation 1, 2, 3. Each more intricate, the architecture rising but never showing off its beams. Her right hand lit the air with the kind of line that makes a person who doesn't understand counterpoint understand something anyway. Her left hand gave it ground and then gave it away,
so the conversation could be honest. At Variation 5, a canon, voices braided so precisely they stopped being voices and became a single idea. Someone in the second row put a hand flat on a chest like they'd remembered breath. At Variation 10, the Fughetta, themes slipped between hands with the calm authority of a teacher who has decided not to raise her voice because she doesn't have to. Conversations died out. Even the servers stopped moving in ways that made sound. Rand's smile worked as hard as it could at its job and then began to underperform. Rand's smile worked as hard as it could at its job and then began to underperform. Ilana reached Variation 15, the slow andante in G minor, an interior chapel disguised as a page of music. Notes lifted and then hung for the precise amount of time it takes sorrow to be honest and not indulgent. A man who had told his wife earlier that the arts budget was bloated and easily reduced swallowed hard and looked at his shoes. A woman who had told herself a story about the kind of person who ends up playing on public pianos revised her draft. At Variation 20, that clean burst of virtuosity that is not ego so much as delight in muscles trained to fluency, applause broke out before the social contract yanked it back. You don't interrupt this, not if you were listening. Rand glanced at his phone as if it had betrayed him by recording this version of him instead of the one he'd planned. Cameras are obedient. Context is not. And then Variation 25, the so-called Black Pearl, arrived like a string pulled tight through a life, and then released just enough to sing. The thing about playing that movement is you can't do it in the abstract. You have to give it something. Ilana gave it the Tuesday morning. The bent notice. The way a hand on a window makes no sound from the other side. She didn't dramatize any of it. She simply didn't withhold. People forgot to move their phones. Breathing went thin. From the wings, Dr. Levi advanced to the edge of the light, with the tentative reverence of a person approaching a piece of news that might change a year. Levi advanced to the edge of the light with the tentative reverence of a person approaching a piece of news that might change a year. Ilana did not check whether any of that landed. She followed the map as written. Variation 26, 27. You could feel the architecture beginning to complete itself, not because it was finishing, but because what had been promised at the start was being kept. She came, at last, to the return of the aria. A homecoming with the home altered because the traveler was. The line was the same and not the same. A distinction music grants because it knows people need the permission. Ilana played the last phrase so cleanly, the air itself learned a posture. She lifted her hands but did not move. Silence arrived. One beat. 2, 3. Then the room detonated. The sound was physical. It hit her ribs and kept going. Chairs scraped stone in a chorus of bad sound that meant the right thing. 500 bodies stood as if pulled. Some ovations are enthusiastic, and some are affirmative. And this one was the latter, the complicated, heavier kind that recognizes more than skill. A few voices yelled "Bravo," because you can't strip the Italian out of music etiquette. Others said "Kol hakavod," because we're in Israel, and certain phrases belong to us. Ilana remained on the bench, which is what her teacher had taught her. Be still until the moment is finished with you. Her hands hovered in the space where work becomes a body's relief. She looked at no one and everyone. It is one of the strange gifts of a performance, that it introduces you to strangers more honestly than acquaintances.
It is one of the strange gifts of a performance that it introduces you to strangers more honestly than acquaintances. Dr. Levi reached the steps first. She was older than the shoes suggested and younger than the eyes let on. Her spine carried the weight of concert seasons and the question, "Is it real?" asked and answered for decades. "Where did you study?" she asked, not bothering to dress the question with context. "That was graduate jury level. That was—" She stopped, not because she couldn't finish the sentence, but because she was wise enough to let the punctuation be applause. "The academy," Ilana said, "before my mother got sick." Levi's face moved through recognition into anger on someone else's behalf. The civic kind, the useful kind. "You left to care for her," she said, and Ilana nodded, because it was the kind of fact that doesn't need verbs. Near the stairs, Ran stood colorless. The phone in his fist was an appliance now, not a weapon. His wife, Maya, looked at him the way a person looks at a place they have been calling home, and recognizing that it has not been taking care of them. Levi turned to the crowd with the skill of someone who had used microphones when microphones were heavy. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "you've just witnessed an artist. Not a curiosity, not a stunt. An artist who paused her studies to keep her family alive." The applause deepened, thickened. It picked up overtones. People applauded their own capacity to adjust a judgment. That can be an ugly thing when it's performative. It wasn't ugly tonight.
It wasn't ugly tonight.
Ilana stood. The bench eased back an inch. She stepped down and crossed the small space to where Ran waited because 500 people were watching him, and a camera is a poor chaperone. Up close, he looked exactly the same, and smaller. Money will do that to a person. Will tell them they take up all the room, and then leave them surprised when there isn't much left. "Mr. Shapira," she said, voice even. "Your 3,000 shekels can wait. Your apology can't." The room took a breath and then refused to exhale until it had something to do with it. Ran's jaw moved like a training exercise. Heat rose into his neck in a bloom that traveling cameras would not forgive. He looked to the board table where people who liked him were recalculating. He looked to Maya, who did not help him. He looked to the floor where his shoes were correct. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out as if they had to pass through gravel. "I'm sorry." Levy didn't do him the harm of lingering on his humiliation. She put an arm around Ilana's shoulders with the confidence of a teacher who has found a student and intends to make that fact a matter of public record. "We're calling the academy tonight," she said. "Full return. Full support." A woman in a green gown stepped forward with the grace of someone who had learned not to interrupt and had decided that this was a time to interrupt. "Rivka Goldstein," she said, "our family foundation funds arts education. Our guest suite is open as long as you need, and it has a piano." The last phrase, "it has a piano," did something to Ilana's chest that was not metaphor. There are sentences that arrive like water, and sentences that arrive like bread. This one did both. A security guard, the same one from downstairs who had kept his hand on his radio like a habit, appeared at the edge of the platform holding Ilana's bent sign. "Music student, seeking assistance." He held it with two hands, the way you hold a thing that has recently revealed itself to be a document rather than trash. An investment banker who had laughed earlier not because he was a bad person, but because he was lazy, stepped forward with a face people reserve for unfunerals. "Mizrahi Foundation," he said. "Emergency grant for artists in crisis. We can set it up tonight." He did not look at Ilana for more than a second, which was his way of not turning the moment into a transaction. "Talia,"
who developed properties and sometimes opinions, already had her phone out and a list in her head. Room service, a hot meal, then housing near campus, practical first. Ilana kept a hand on her ring. The hall was loud, and beneath the noise a different kind of sound was happening. The quiet reordering that occurs when a narrative breaks and you decide which parts to keep. She nodded once, because her body wasn't ready to do more. Relief and adrenaline make strange neighbors. Backstage, Levi dialed. "Aviva," she said when the line clicked live. "You need to hear this. One of yours came home tonight." Her voice did not break on home, but it could have, and everyone in the corridor behaved as if it had. By midnight, the ballroom remembered its other duties: wine and pledges, and the understandable pleasure of being seen in a certain place, in a certain dress, by the people you need to see you. The center of gravity had shifted, which is not something rooms will admit, but you can tell by the way people talk to themselves in the mirrors. Rand stayed long enough to be seen staying, and left early enough to claim an emergency. Maya remained. People forgot which side of her they were on, and then decided to be on no side. Sometimes decency is just withholding alignment until you earn one. People forgot which side of her they were on, and then decided to be on no side. Sometimes decency is just withholding alignment until you earn one. The next morning, the academy confirmed what Levi had promised, because she did not promise things she couldn't deliver. Tuition, covered. Housing, arranged. A practice room with a working Steinway, reserved under Cohen, Ilana. A student affairs officer who had already been kind to 3 students before lunch. Put together a folder with a campus map, a list of counselors, and the hours for the shared kitchen in the dorm. Ilana ate a proper breakfast. Eggs that were eggs, and bread that was bread, and coffee that had been made for someone who would have a day, and not merely survive one. She took a shower that found all the places the weather had lived in her. She slept in a bed that did not move when a bus passed. On Monday, she walked into the academy in a borrowed blazer and jeans that had seen worse days behave. She had a schedule in her pocket and a pen tucked into the seam of her glove. Students are students almost everywhere. Hopeful and a little loud. Tired and expansive in their plans. Poor and rich in the same currency. No one stared. Attention is a form of currency too. On campuses, it is spent on self-mythologies and deadlines. They stared when she sat in Studio C and began to play. Sound does its own kind of introduction. The first week, Ilana relearned the routine that turns talent into a day. Warm up with scales, slow for control, quick for calibration. Broken chords to wake the wrists. Metronome at honest tempos. A break that involves leaving the room so the room can forget you were there. Bach for posture, Chopin for breath, Debussy for horizon. Lunch, work, water. She learned which practice rooms ran cold and which pianos had a dominant middle E, which professors insisted on the addition and which said, "Eyes up from the page." She learned to look people in the face again. You can only look down for so long before the body learns a shape that is not good for it. In the evenings, she took the bus to see Moshe. On good days, he remembered child without a name, which was enough. On bad days, he talked to a sequence of days that had been true once. She read to him anyway. She held his hand and named the bones like a student names keys. Metacarpal, phalanx, radius, ulna. A nurse who had worked with Devora took care of paperwork the way people in that profession do, without drama and with the competence that calms. Ilana's professors did the work of teachers who have seen talent come back from a fire. They gave assignments like they were normal and praise like it was dangerous. In studio class, she played the aria again, And a first year who measured his worth in the speed of his trills looked at the floor when he clapped, because he understood something he hadn't understood an hour earlier. In studio class, she played the aria again, and a first year who measured his worth in the speed of his trills looked at the floor when he clapped, because he understood something he hadn't understood an hour earlier. The second week, Ilana ran hands with a metronome set lower than her pride. She took calluses back from the city and gave them to the keys, where they made better use of them. She learned where her posture had collapsed and built it back with a teacher's hands at her shoulder blades. Down, then wide. She wrote water on the back of her left glove again, because old habits serve new lives too. The month before her senior recital, she practiced in a room with a window that showed a strip of sky and a stairwell where people said things they would regret and then forgot they had said them. She marked fingerings in pencil and erased them when they lied. She ate yogurt from containers and almonds from a bag, and drank coffee she admitted was bad and needed. She taped her mother's ring during scales so it wouldn't slip at speed. She learned the rest without tape, because you cannot arrive at a stage held together by anything other than your own agreement to be there. She learned the rest without tape, because you cannot arrive at a stage held together by anything other than your own agreement to be there. On a Thursday in late winter, she walked through the first station at dusk. She didn't plan to play. She went because the body remembers routes and sometimes suggests them when the mind has run out. The public piano was occupied by a child whose parents were letting her bang loudly enough to be disliked and not loudly enough to be told so. Ilana paused at the edge of the canopy anyway. The wind did its particular evening thing, picked a direction and stuck to it. Vendors called end-of-day prices in voices that had done that for years. Life held. She put 1 shekel into the cup and kept walking. In a different house, Ron sat at a table with a laptop and a glass he didn't finish. He rewatched the recording because people who lose control of a narrative sometimes think they can take it back by owning the file. The video did not like him. It held still when he needed it to blink. Maya came in and did not set a hand on his shoulder. They spoke in the hushed, hot tones of people who know the neighbors can hear everything. She went to bed. He stayed. The house was quiet in the particular way big houses are, furnished silence. In another house, Dr. Levy opened a folder. Inside, names, dates, a printout of a financial aid package. A note to self that read, "Check housing. Quiet neighbors? HL." She placed it beside a stack that contained other names and other notes with equally practical questions. She had learned, after a lifetime of art, that justice required filing systems. She had learned, after a lifetime of art, that justice required filing systems. That weekend, Ilana visited the grave. She brought a small stone from the path and placed it with the others. She didn't speak aloud because she didn't need to. The sentence most available to her was the simplest one she had. "I'm here." The air accepted it, without ceremony or sound. The Academy printed the poster for her recital 2 weeks later. The designer chose a typeface that had learned the elegance of illegibility without perfecting it. Which is to say, it was a conservatory poster. The date and time were perfectly readable. The program note, written by a professorial hand that knew what it meant to both overstate and undersell, took care to be neither. On the morning of the performance, Ilana stared at her hands for 10 minutes. She washed them, and then washed them again. She taped nothing. She placed her ring on, and then took it off, and then put it on again. She ate toast. She did not count the hours. Counting hours makes them longer. She did not count the hours. Counting hours makes them longer. Afternoon. A warm-up at an honest tempo.
A nap that was not one. A message from Dr. Levi with no words, just a photo of the hall from row 3. A message from Rivka. Stage door at 6:15. I'll be there with flowers and a sandwich. Eat the sandwich first. A message from a first year. Break a leg. Sorry, do we say that for piano? I think we do. Break a leg. A message from Talia with a dry joke about seating charts and donors who fight for aisle seats like it's a sport. A line from the nurse at Moshe's facility. We'll stream the first piece. He likes the one that starts like a church. Ilana texted back Aria, and then thank you, and then nothing. Because there are moments the body doesn't want the phone to borrow attention. Evening slid its hands over the city and pressed. The hall took in bodies and coats and the sound of boots that had made long days shorter. People who had been at the gala months ago took seats and did not speak about it. People who had not been at the gala took seats and did not speak about not being at the gala. The room made a promise to the stage, and the stage made a promise back. It's what good rooms do. It's what artists depend on. It's what artists depend on. Behind the curtain, Ilana breathed on count. The stage manager clicked through cues like rosary beads. A tuner leaned a body against a wall and let the math he'd done in the afternoon keep doing. Dr. Levi took her seat with Rivka in a civic posture perfected across decades. Attentive, grateful, judgment suspended until the work made it necessary. Ilana stepped into the light. She placed her hands. The aria again. There's a superstition to familiarity. The way you tell yourself that beginning is a kind of return. When you know very well, it's a threshold. The first phrase landed without tremor. The second opened as if someone had oiled a hinge overnight. The room adjusted to the hum of the instrument, and the hum inside their own chests. People who didn't like Bach liked this. People who loved Bach tried not to move too quickly toward gratitude. She took the single breath between reverence and work, and then work began. Variation 1, 2, 3. What had been dazzling in the ballroom months ago was now clean without anxiety, clarity that didn't require nerves to push it forward. Her right hand drew lines and her left fitted them into a frame. It felt less like a display than like an argument with no opponents. In the third row, Dr. Hannah Levy allowed herself 2 blinks in rapid succession and then returned to stillness. Beside her, Rivka kept her hands folded in her lap, the posture of a person who knows she will soon get to move and refuses to rush the privilege. 2 seats away, Maya sat on the aisle with a program in her lap, and her mouth pressed into a line that wasn't unhappiness or anger. It was the posture people wear when they've decided to conduct themselves. 2 seats away, Maya sat on the aisle with a program in her lap and her mouth pressed into a line that wasn't unhappiness or anger. It was the posture people wear when they've decided to conduct themselves. In a small room miles away, a nurse angled a tablet and adjusted the volume. Moshe watched not with comprehension, but with attention, which is its own kind of respect. When the opening phrase arrived, he made a sound that might have been a word and might have been the shape of one in a mouth that no longer trusted speech to do what it promised. The nurse put a hand on his shoulder and said, "Your daughter," not to tell him, but to teach the sentence to the room. Variation 5. The canon. Voices braided like a tallit fringe twisted between habitual fingers. A violist in the balcony, who had come to audit a piano recital the way dentists attend lectures on knees, leaned in despite herself. Variation 8. The dance in the middle distance, weight shifting in ways that called to a memory of moving.
Variation 10. The Fughetta. Themes entering like guests who know exactly how long to stay and exactly when to leave. What the ballroom had not allowed, because ballrooms do not know how to do it, was the long patience of a hall built for listening. Ilana could feel the room agree to time. You don't always get that. You hope for it, and you do honest work toward it. And if the gods of acoustics and weather and human mood are kind, it arrives. It arrived. It arrived. When she reached Variation 15, the slow andante, she allowed more quiet than she'd planned. Space reveals a player's ethics. She did not coat the rests with sentiment. She honored them. Grief wasn't a performance goal anymore. It was a fact that had learned, mercifully, to stop demanding justification. In row 12, a man who had prepared to fidget discovered his hands had chosen a better project: being still. The aria is not a narrative so much as a map that trusts its traveler. The traveler was different. The map was not. The miracle was that it worked either way. At Variation 20, the bright architecture of virtuosity lifted the room like a good joke told in a funeral parlor. The relief not from disrespect, but from fidelity to the living. People smiled without embarrassment. A child at the back, dragged by a parent who refused to apologize for culture, sat up straight for the first time that evening. A child at the back, dragged by a parent who refused to apologize for culture, sat up straight for the first time that evening. Variation 25, the so-called Black Pearl, arrived without announcement, which is the only decent way for such a thing to enter. The difference from months earlier wasn't weight, it was weight-bearing. Her tone didn't ask to be admired, it asked to be trusted. She let the line sit on the edge of dissolving, and then brought it back, as if demonstrating to the room what rescue looks like when it doesn't announce itself as heroism. In the cheap seats, a teenager who had come to make fun of classical music because his friends were going to a bar afterward, felt something slide into place behind his sternum, and did not mention it later, because he did not yet have the vocabulary. The sequence marched, and then sang, and then did both. Variation 28 learned to glow. Variation 29 remembered to laugh. Variation 30, Quodlibet, wove joy around a spine made of math and modesty. If anyone in the audience had wanted to clap right there, they would have been forgiven. But nobody did. The room understood the shape of the arc. She came home to the aria as if she had never left, and as if nothing would ever be the same. She played the last chords not with the softness of apology, but with the gentle insistence of a fact. The air held still. The sound decayed in a way that makes you believe decay can be a kind of blessing. The sound decayed in a way that makes you believe decay can be a kind of blessing. Silence again, the expensive kind. Then bodies rose in a sound like weather breaking. Flowers the size of a small economy toppled forward in bouquets. The applause carried that double tone the ballroom had learned and the hall refined. Celebration on top, recognition underneath. Ilana stood, bowed once, and did not overwork the gratitude. She left the stage because you must, and returned because decency demanded it, and bowed again from the waist. When she backed away for the second time, the applause narrowed rather than diminished. It became something like a beam. Backstage, a stagehand with a headset and a heart that had learned to tidy emotion with tasks, handed her water and the sandwich Rivka had smuggled past sense. "Half," the stagehand said. Then interviews. Ilana nodded and obeyed, because pianists know how to follow orders that keep them human.
Những câu hỏi tử tế.
Dr. Levy appeared quickly enough to suggest she had learned shortcuts for these hallways in earlier lives. She touched Ilana's shoulders with both hands, the way teachers do when they have no other way to say, this meant something, and they are wise enough to keep words small. Real, she said. Real. She didn't attempt a longer sentence. Rivka managed to put the bouquet into a corner without breaking it, and then put a second sandwich into Ilana's bag without ceremony. It keeps, she said, which was half false and exactly right. She glanced at the schedule someone had taped to the wall. You have 10 minutes before the press learns our names again. Maya waited her turn. When Ilana looked up, she stepped forward with a practiced calm people mistake for indifference when they don't understand how hard calm can be. You don't need anything from me, she said without preamble. But I owe you something. She held out an envelope and then withdrew it half an inch. Not money. An introduction. 3, actually. Teachers. A festival director. People who return calls. She offered the envelope again. Use them, or tear them up. Just don't tell me later you didn't have time. Ilana took it and put it into the bag with the sandwich. Thank you, she said. Maya nodded, as if that were the correct answer on a test they had both decided to pass. The interviews were not unkind. The first went to the campus paper, which asked good questions because students often do when adults forget how. The second went to a National Arts Weekly. A reporter with a pencil and a habit of listening asked, "What changed between the hotel and tonight?" Ilana considered the easy answers, practice, rest, time, and then told the truth. I stopped playing not to lose. I started playing to say what I meant. The reporter wrote it down and, to her credit, didn't decorate it. After the last handshake, Ilana stepped into a narrow corridor that admitted exactly one person's width of relief. She rested her head against a painted cinder block and watched the breath go in and out of her body the way it goes in and out of other people's bodies. Unexceptional, and therefore perfect. When she opened her eyes, Dr. Raviva Sharong was there, hair like a storm map, eyes that could set a metronome without touching it. Child, Sharon said, because she had earned that right with decades of specific kindness. Welcome home. She left it at that, because she had also earned brevity. And she left it at that, because she had also earned brevity. The afterlife of a recital consists of cameras, programs folded into souvenirs, and promises only some people intend to keep. What mattered didn't ride home in anyone's handbag. It stayed in Ilana's hands, which woke the next morning sore in the places that prove you did something worth doing. She made coffee. She taped nothing. She went to Studio C and stared at a score she didn't yet know and put her fingers down anyway, because that's how everything gets learned. Measure by measure. The way a life gets learned when you are patient or have run out of other choices. Letters arrived. Emails too. The letters mattered more because paper insists on a moment. One carried the crest of the Israeli Arts Fund. It was written on stationery heavy enough to discourage editing, and signed by a person whose assistant had good penmanship. Ms. Cohen, on behalf of the board, I am pleased to inform you that the fund is establishing the Devorah Cohen Scholarship for promising pianists at the Academy. Your performance last night made the decision simple. We would be honored if you would accept the inaugural award. Respectfully, Miriam Alkali, Chair. No mention of Ran in that letter. There didn't need to be. Another arrived the same day. Plain envelope, familiar surname in a hand that had learned carefulness too late. Ms. Cohen. Cohen, I do not expect forgiveness, and I'm aware apologies arrive poorer than they should, especially when they travel late. Enclosed is a donation to the scholarship fund in your mother's name. It does not repair anything I broke. I hope it helps someone who shouldn't have to ask. Ran Shapira. The check was large enough to be reported. The letter was small enough to be human. Ilana sat with both for a while and then put the scholarship letter under a magnet on her refrigerator, because some reminders help you keep a refrigerator stocked. She put Ran's letter in a manila folder labeled Paper, Keep, because not everything belongs on public walls. Weeks became weeks the way they do when you are busy. The academy asked her to play on a donor night and she said yes, because money keeps pianos maintained, and because she had decided not to confuse pride with strategy. She auditioned for a summer festival on the coast and got in. She began helping in a first-year studio on Thursday afternoons because the teacher asked, and because she remembered how beginners look at the room when they're trying to remember they deserve it. She began helping in a first-year studio on Thursday afternoons because the teacher asked, and because she remembered how beginners look at the room when they're trying to remember they deserve it. The boy from the balcony, his name turned out to be Ori, showed up 40 minutes early for the studio and sat in the back pretending to tune a violin string that didn't need it. Ilana asked him after the session, "What do you hear when you think you don't like Bach?" He blinked like she'd caught him stealing. "Scales," he admitted. "Homework." She nodded. The trick is to hear a person talking so clearly that the grammar disappears. That takes time and curiosity. He looked at the floor the way the first year had months ago. She sent him away with a movement to listen to and one to try not to like. He returned a week later annoyed that he'd failed. She saw Maya twice, once in a coffee shop where Maya ordered tea like it was a plan, and once on a sidewalk where they exchanged exactly 9 words about weather and courage. People who stay in your life do not always stay close to its center. Maya turned out to be someone who could live in the outer ring with integrity. Dr. Levy became a fact, appearing at the end of hallways with questions that were really encouragements, at doors with forms that needed signatures, at the foot of stages with nods you could cash like checks. She didn't hover. Artists are allergic to that. She accompanied. It's rarer. It's rarer. Ilana went to the long-term care facility twice a week. On a Tuesday that smelled like disinfectant and saffron, someone had been generous with their lunch. She sat with Moshe under a window that knew how to make afternoon decent. She took his hand and named bones quietly the way she always did. He looked at her, and then through her, and then at the window. She began the aria under her breath, fingers spelling the shape on his palm. He blinked and made a sound that wasn't a word but was an approximation of the sentence, "I am listening." A minute later he said, "Ill," and stopped because that's what the mouth did now. "It's all right," she told him. "I know." The nurse wiped her eyes and said she wasn't crying, which is a thing nurses are allowed to say even when everyone knows. The festival on the coast moved like salt through her summer, into everything, preserving what mattered. She played in a church whose roof learned patience from seagulls, and in a museum courtyard where people who didn't like to sit agreed to stand for an hour, and then forgot to move. A young composer with a ferocious laugh and a new suite asked if she'd read through his pages. She did, and a week later they performed one movement in a cafe full of chairs that wobbled and patrons who clapped at the wrong times and exactly the right reasons. She learned that the boundary between work and life is fake when you're lucky, and necessary when you're not. She tried to honor both conditions.
She learned that the boundary between work and life is fake when you're lucky and necessary when you're not. She tried to honor both conditions. In late August, the academy asked if she would talk to incoming students for 12 minutes. Not inspiring, the dean said quickly, having learned that word can ruin an honest speech. Just true. She stood at a podium that had been built for taller people and told them 3 things. Find teachers who expect more from you than you do from yourself, but in the direction you want to go. Protect your practice like it protects you. Time is not a suggestion, it's an appointment. Let your life make the music better, not louder. If it makes it louder, turn and pick up the part you dropped. Afterward, a girl with a braid asked, "What if money is the answer and the question?" Ilana wanted to say, "Then it's a bad test." But she said, "Then we strategize," and walked the girl downstairs to Rivka's office, because sometimes the most radical act is knowing who keeps the purse. Ilana wanted to say, "Then it's a bad test." But she said, "Then we strategize," and walked the girl downstairs to Rivka's office, because sometimes the most radical act is knowing who keeps the purse. Fall brought weather that wasn't theatrical enough to mention in poems, and therefore suited to work. Ilana learned a new program that frightened her in the right ways. She played through fatigue without feeding it. She said no to 2 obligations that were really compliments, and yes to one that would require eating dinner in buses for a week. She left the first station piano alone most days, not because she was proud, but because letters arrive and calendars fill, and there are only so many places a person can be. On a Saturday evening, she sat under the canopy with a paper cup of soup and listened to a teenager stumble through Clair de Lune without malice. She put a coin in the cup and smiled when the teenager forgot to nod. Being young is labor. There were complications. There always are. A tendon complained on a Wednesday and kept complaining through the weekend because tendons have their own ethics. Ilana learned to ice after, not before. To rest an hour and then rest another when ego demanded otherwise. A well-meaning donor suggested she smile more during fast passages, and she smiled less for 3 weeks on principle, before forgiving the comment its clumsiness. A review misheard a movement and praised her for a quality she didn't value. She practiced anyway. Winter set down a hand without asking. Ilana bought gloves she did not knit. She taped her mother's ring again and thought about how circles look like promises and sometimes behave like work. She kept seeing Mizrahi at events funded by his foundation. He nodded with the humility of a person who hopes to keep making better choices and knows habits require tending. Near the year's end, the Academy installed a small brass plate beside Studio C. The letters were plain. Devorah Cohen Practice Room. For the work that makes the music. Ilana touched the plate with 2 fingers, and then went inside and warmed up at an honest tempo. She sent a photo of the plate to the nurse at the facility, who printed it and taped it to the wall by Moshe's bed. On a day that smelled like rain deciding, Ran requested a meeting. Ilana said yes, and chose a lobby with light and tables close enough that no one would mistake the conversation for confidential. He arrived on time, wearing a suit that wanted to apologize for him. She wore the jeans she practiced in and a jacket that told weather to wait. "I won't take much of your time," he said. He spoke softer now. Public correction sometimes does that to a man. "I intend to keep funding the scholarship." He paused, as if waiting for absolution that would not be offered. I plan to step down from the Arts Fund board at the end of the season." "Why?" Ilana asked. "Because if a person offers information to the room, it's permitted to ask the room to take responsibility for it. Because I've been very good at raising money,
and very bad at recognizing worth unless it arrives with credentials I already understand. He looked at his hands in the way guilty teenagers do. It's not a revelation, it's arithmetic. I added wrong in public. Math can be relearned, Ilana said. He nodded at the mercy without accepting it as pardon. They parted without promise. Sometimes endings don't require speeches. They require distance. In the spring, a first year named Shy showed up with a hand position that belonged to someone twice his size, and a terror of slow practice that belonged to someone half his age. He rushed, and then apologized, which is one of the great cycles of youth. Ilana made him count rests as if they were notes, and watch a clock as if it were a teacher's face. 2 months later, he played 4 bars correctly and beamed like a person who had won a medal. She clapped once and said, "Again," because adults who care do not let celebration interrupt momentum. She clapped once and said, "Again," because adults who care do not let celebration interrupt momentum. At Hadassah, Moshe had a day where the words arranged themselves into a shape the mouth recognized. He said, "Girl," and then, "Mine," and then laughed because both were true, and because he had found a sentence with his body that his mind could climb into. Ilana held his hand and counted bones again as if she were counting blessings in a language she trusted. The nurse texted Dr. Levy a smiley face with too many parentheses. Levy, who did not use emojis without intent, sent it to Rivka anyway. A newspaper wrote a profile and almost ruined it with adjectives. Ilana fixed it in the interview by being exact. A television show asked her to perform on a morning program and she said no, because the piano was plastic. A community center in a neighborhood that never gets named in glossy magazines asked for a workshop for kids who only know music through phones. She said yes, and took 3 keyboards that fit into a hatchback and a volunteer who could check chords without fuss. She taught a Bach line to a boy who knew 4 chords for rap hooks, and they both left with a better idea of what bridge can mean. She taught a Bach line to a boy who knew 4 chords for rap hooks, and they both left with a better idea of what bridge can mean. In June, she walked past the first station at the Blue Hour and found the piano unattended and in tune enough to be forgiven. The canopy held its evening ache. She sat without the sign and without the cup, and put her hands down like a person greeting a friend at a bus stop. Aria again. Because why pretend you don't love what you love? A small ring of people formed and then behaved themselves. A child approached with 2 fingers extended like a pilgrim requesting a relic. Ilana nodded and the child touched a key, startled at the sound her little pressure could pull from wood and wire. The mother mouthed, "Sorry." Ilana shook her head no and kept playing. A young woman in a coat too thin for the wind stood farther back than necessary and cried quietly. Ilana watched her only from the corner of her eye, because attention can feel like interrogation. When the last chord decayed, the woman wiped her face with the back of her wrist and said, "I used to." Ilana considered and then said, "You still do?" The woman shook her head and then nodded, and then left before the body betrayed her mouth with too much honesty. The woman shook her head and then nodded, and then left before the body betrayed her mouth with too much honesty. That night, Ilana walked home along a route she didn't need to keep safe anymore, but kept anyway. The city made its noises, pigeons arguing doctrine, buses offering absolution, a scooter insisting on its right to move like impatience. She passed the bakery where they sell the small sesame rings, and the corner where she had once slept in a windbreak that wasn't. She didn't stop. She didn't need to turn a pilgrimage into a ceremony. Walking past was sufficient. Summer festival again, and this time she arrived with a piece by the young composer with the ferocious laugh now tempered by a grant and an editor. They rehearsed in a space that used to be a synagogue and now was a cultural center that knew how to keep both versions of itself. The premiere went well. The post-concert conversation went better. People asked about measures where he had hidden melodies and she had found them. And then someone asked about practice, and Ilana said the thing she believed most. Practice is a form of honesty. In September, the scholarship committee announced that the Devorah Cohen Fund would support not just tuition but also the unglamorous necessities: reeds, strings, photocopies, physiotherapy, transit. Ilana wrote the phrase on a sticky note and put it above her desk. Unglamour is where lives are saved.
Unglamour is where lives are saved. She spoke once at a small synagogue in Kiryat Menachem, her neighborhood, the place that had taught her how to be expensive in the ways that don't cost money. She played one movement and then didn't perform a speech. She told a story about a ring and a piano, and a woman who refused to let the world shrink her, and a man who learned to count again. People cried like they cry when they aren't sure whether to clap at the end of something that felt like prayer. No one took a video, or if they did, they didn't post it. Either way, the room held. At the end of the year, the Academy asked Ilana to teach a seminar on stagecraft for pianists, which sounded grand and turned out to be 12 students who needed to learn to walk on and off a platform without apologizing with their shoulders. She taught them how to bow like gratitude instead of surrender. She taught them where to look when they need to look at no one and everyone. She taught them how to breathe when the breath doesn't want to be bossed. The students pretended to be above it, and then thanked her with an earnestness they tried to hide. She accepted the thanks and assigned scales at a tempo that would make them honest. In the quiet after the term, the Academy Hall stood empty, except for a janitor sweeping with the expertise of someone who knew how to make edges matter. Ilana walked to the front row and put a white rose on seat A7. No one asked why. Some gestures don't require curating. Some gestures don't require curating.
She sat on the edge of the stage and swung her feet once like a child who hasn't been told not to. The building hummed, the way buildings hum when they are asleep and dreaming of seasons. In the dark, the Steinway made a shape against absence that registered as comfort. She didn't play. She thought about G major, and about the Tuesday mornings that don't make news, and about men who apologize too late and still decide to do one more correct thing, and women who apologize at the right time and then do 5 correct things without narrating them, and girls who learn the weight of their own hands, and boys who learn to be quiet in rooms that deserve it. Life went on, not like a moral, but like a schedule. Studio, scales, lunch, visit, practice, teach, rest. A bus that arrived when it promised. A bed that didn't move when traffic did. The extraordinary flattened into routine in the best way. Sustained, repeatable, owned. On a morning like any other, Ilana folded laundry and listened to a recording of herself from a practice room. 15 again. The little chapel that lives inside a larger house. It sounded like a person being very careful and very brave at the same time. She smiled at the awkward places without contempt, the way you smile at a child practicing standing. She smiled at the awkward places without contempt, the way you smile at a child practicing standing. She put the ring on and left the apartment. The day had an appointment with her hands. The door closed behind her the way doors do when they accept you're leaving and promise to take your return seriously. Outside, the city did what cities do. Inside the practice room, the piano did what pianos do. Ilana did what people do when they have learned not to hide. She worked.